want to begin by saying it's always a thrill to have a Democrat say such nice things about me. And golly, Skip, I recorded all of them, and I'll repeat them often. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. I'll try to keep the remarks brief, which doesn't mean a thing when I say that, because most of you know that brevity to somebody who was in politics and the ministry both doesn't mean a whole lot. And the other thing, I will leave some time for some questions, and then we'll spend a little time signing books, and I'm just so glad you're here. It's a delight for me to be not only at the Clinton School, frankly, it's just great to be back at Arkansas. I was home Thanksgiving Day, and basically that was the only day I've been home since about the early part of October, because between a book tour, which put us in 64 cities in 21 days, in 22 states, and then being in New York every week, most every week from Thursday through Sunday, my life on the road is intense. And so I spend a lot of the time either there or speaking somewhere around the country, and my Arkansas time is extremely limited. And when I get home, it is so nice to be able to look around and see wonderful people, great scenes. And I'll tell you how bad the travel has been. I haven't been duck hunting yet. Some of you, I see Rex Nelson out here. Rex will appreciate what an incredible sacrifice it is. The season is almost a month in, and I've yet to go. But tomorrow, I make up for it. I'm going. So anyway, thanks for being here. This is a delight. I want to say I've got several of my family members here. My wife, Janet, of course, is here. My son, David, his wife, Lauren, daughter, Sarah, and my niece, Katie Beth, is somewhere. I saw her earlier. So there she is over there. If I have any other family members here, I'm sure they'd rather me not mention it, because most people, especially after reading the book, are not sure they want to be named in the family. As I mentioned in the Christmas book, my dad used to tell me as a kid growing up, son, don't look too far up your family tree. There's stuff up there you don't need to see. If you read the Christmas book called A Simple Christmas, you'll understand why that really was very appropriate. I've had more fun with this book. This is the 7th book that I've done. It is my personal favorite. It's called A Simple Christmas because the message of it is that the best Christmases we ever have are the ones that are not focused around the expense of gifts, but rather the value of our relationships. And as people read the stories, it has been very, maybe an affirmation over and over to me, that people will tell me that the book made them think of their own families, their lives, their stories, which is exactly what I hoped would happen. It's not so much that they would say, oh, here's the way Huckabee grew up. Here was what he did when he was a kid, when he and his sister unwrapped all their Christmas presents while the parents were away at work and played with the toys and did that. We did that every year. We were professional at it. My sister ended up becoming a theater major and a drama teacher for many years, and I tell people that the reason that she was able to be so effective in theater was because we learned to act when our parents would come home, and we acted like we didn't know what was under the tree. We would unwrap everything and play with it all afternoon, and just before they got home, we would carefully put it back in the boxes, and she was amazingly good at wrapping it up and putting the tape back on, and you know, Christmas morning would come, we'd like, oh, what a surprise. We did it for years until the Christmas morning I unwrapped my box and pulled out a football that was covered in mud. I tried to explain it was the new Sears thing of the J.C. Higgins football now came play ready. They didn't buy it, the gig was up, and we never saw anything wrapped and put under the tree again. That is the God's truth. From that point on, we had to go hunting for it somewhere in the house, and we got where they knew that that wasn't going to work either. It's a miracle we ever had Christmas after that. I tell the story of my first electric guitar, and it's a very special story to me because for several years I'd been asking my parents, please get me an electric guitar. From the time the Beatles first hit the stage on Ed Sullivan in 1964, in February of that year, I knew that there was one thing in life I really wanted to be, a rock and roll musician. I still want to be a rock and roll musician. And I never made that either. So I kept asking for the electric guitar, and they would always say, well, what else would you want? I'd put other stuff on the list, and I'd get the other stuff. So in 1966, I'm 11 years old, and I decided, to heck with the other stuff. I'm going to put one thing on the list, electric guitar. And they said, what else would you want? I said, that's it. If I can't have that, I want nothing. I mean, I really laid it out there. I mean, how else? Looking back, they should have given me nothing. And I now know how close I was to getting nothing. But my parents, who I didn't understand how much money $99 was. I mean, I'm not, at age 11, you don't look at your parents' tax returns and say, oh my gosh, that's it? It took my parents a year, monthly payments to JCPenney, where they ordered the guitar from the catalog. It was all of $99 is what they paid, $99 for the guitar, the little amplifier, the whole rig. They made an incredible sacrifice to get that guitar for me. And it was years later before I fully comprehended the level of commitment it required for them to do that. And yet that guitar was life-changing for me. And I know you're going to find this very difficult to believe, but I grew up a very bashful kid. And I was scared to death of people. I really was. And it was the gift of that guitar that gave me the ability to get even capable of standing in front of other people and playing in little country, western, and rock bands all through high school was really the difference in so many ways for my life of getting where I could face a crowd of people. So if it hadn't been for that guitar, I wouldn't be here today, and you probably wouldn't either. So there we go. By the way, the little postscript of the story that I mentioned in the book, that guitar is now on display at the Old State House Museum, and it is part of the collection of memorabilia from the governors. And when the staff asked all of the past governors, would they be willing to give some things that had some special meaning, I think if I recall right, it's been a while since I've been there, but there was I think some memorabilia from Governor Rockefeller, Governor Bumpers, Governor Pryor, Governor Clinton, all the people who have been governor, and some are like suits and things from their desk. And what I gave was the guitar, which, long story, I'll let you read the book to figure out how I got it back. That's called marketing, by the way. But the point is that that guitar is still around, and it's now on display where people can see it. And one of the reasons I wanted to give it, because I hope to encourage some kid who might come through that museum on a school field trip and to see that you'll never know what something that seems like it's so simple can have such an impact. I want to mention one thing about the book, then I'm going to open to your questions. The book is called A Simple Christmas, as I said. It's about understanding the simplicity. And the first thing I want to do is take the reader back to the first Christmas, because I think that what has happened over the years, we have romanticized and sentimentalized the Christmas story, and we've created a version that is fit for consumption by people going to church with their kids. Very different than the real story that happened in Bethlehem. And I say that the real story of what happened in Bethlehem is probably more fitting for a Jerry Springer episode than an Oprah Winfrey one. Because you got to remember, this is the story of an unwed teen mother who's probably about 14. And imagine the scorn and the scandal that happens in her hometown of Nazareth when she's pregnant and not married, and she's claiming that she's never had relationships with anybody, and not even the person to whom she is engaged. And she announces that, don't worry, this is perfectly okay. I'm not a bad girl. I'm pregnant with God's child. Now, somebody showing up in Little Rock and saying, don't worry, I know I'm a teen mom and all this, but it's okay because God is the Father. Folks, it required some pretty amazing conviction and belief for her to be able to withstand the pressure. Now, in the classic government style, proving that modern government is not the first to be stupid, a census is required of all the people who live in Israel at the time. And in the genius of government, instead of taking the census taker and bringing him to the people, they ask all the people to go to the census taker. Isn't that a great idea? Utter efficiency for sure. So Mary and Joseph end up going to Bethlehem. They don't live there. They don't have really any connections there, no family, no friends there. So it's a pretty tough journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And when they get there, she goes into labor. Now, she goes into labor, and there's no place for them to find shelter, nothing. And we always hear about there's no room in the inn, like they go down to the Peabody and see if there's a room available, and oh, they can't find. Look, people had little rooms that they had left over in their house, and they would rent them out. So it wasn't like hotels in the way we think of it today. But there wasn't anybody in the community that even had so much as a spare room. So the only place they can find shelter is in a little grotto, which is a cave. All the ways that we depict the manger scene and the nativity is so totally 20th century and very westernized. It has nothing to do with it. If you see these like wooden barn structures that look like that it came somewhere out of the cornfields of Iowa, it was nothing like that. It's actually a little cave. And so it would be cut out in the stone, and the animals would be there. And this is the only place they could find shelter. So I want you to picture, and if you can, imagine the extraordinary stench in this stone cave with sheep and goats and all that they do, how dirty and filthy it is, how foul it must have smelled. And this is where she has to go and find shelter, as she now is imminent to give birth. Who does she have helping her? We don't know if maybe the guy who owned the little grotto, if he came out and helped, or the wife. We don't know. It may have been her and Joseph and the sheep and the goats. What we do know is there was apparently no midwife, no physician, no sterile environment. She didn't have a saddle block or an epidural to ease the pain. And she and Joseph, chances are, had not gone through Lamaze classes. And I don't mean to be facetious or seem irreverent. I just want you to understand that what was going on here is not this wonderful pageant where Mary is, oh, everything is sweet. What a silent night. Let's have some hymns. I was present at the birth of all three of my kids. Janet was not singing hymns to me. I can tell you that right now. For all of you who have given birth, I don't think that you would say, yes, it was such a silent night. Nothing quiet about it. It was painful. But add to that the humiliation of having to go through that experience with the attendants at the birth, sheep and goats, and a teenage boy named Joseph, who's probably totally wide-eyed at what all this is going on. There were not angels singing and choirs going on there. That happened later on in the fields with the shepherds. And the baby is born, and she takes the baby and wraps him. And again, you know, I used to hear this in the church pageants every year, wrapped him in swaddling clothes. And I thought, how wonderful that must be. I wonder where you can get those swaddling clothes. I want to go down to the department store. Excuse me, do you have anything in swaddling clothes in my size? Well, swaddling clothes really means rags, and the baby would be tightly wrapped in the rags of whatever would be available, wrapped in swaddling clothes and then placed in a manger, which means the food dish for the animal. A piece of stone hewn out so that the water would be held or the food could be there. And so this idea of this romantic crib-like device is nonsense. This was a child who was wrapped in rags and placed the only place he could be, which was in the food dish that animals had eaten out of just a few minutes before. And that is the birth of Jesus. Now, why is that important? Well, because maybe we look sometimes and think, God would not understand my life because I feel deserted and alone and abandoned, and He wouldn't understand. He could never identify with a person like me because my life is so lonely and filled with pain and humiliation and hurt. And then if we could really go back, not to the pageant version, not to the one we created in church, but to the real one, I think we would say, yeah, I think God would understand because He started out just like that or worse. If I were God, I'd have done it differently. I really would have. And chances are you would have too. And the power of the Christmas is that it's about the most wonderful moment in human history happening in the most unlikely of circumstances and settings. And so this book is to remind us all that the best Christmases that we ever have may not be the most elaborate, the most expensive, the most outrageous and extravagant. They may be, in fact, the simple, and sometimes they're even the painful ones, the ones in which it appears that God has disappeared and abandoned us, when in fact, when we think that things couldn't get any worse, that's when sometimes He shows up in a big way. I hope you'll enjoy the book. It's called A Simple Christmas, and I'll leave it at that. We don't have to take questions on A Simple Christmas, but Skip, you have a microphone. Oh, dangerous. So we'll take a few questions.
And now I can give my bad introduction. Just kidding. All right, questions for the governor. Gosh,
well, that's been easy. Thank you very much.
We got.
That's great.
I started to say, wow.
There is life after politics, isn't
That's
there?
right. We have one right here in the back, yes.
Hi, Governor. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm a student here at the school, and I have to deviate from the topic of your book because so many people that are in the political arena that come to the school, we ask about you and your aspirations and what people think about where you're going to be in 2012. So can you tell us what do you think about the Republican primary in 2012, please?
Okay. And the honest answer is I don't know. I haven't ruled anything out, but I think we've got to first get through the 2010 elections and see where those take us. Running for president, as Skip can attest from his friend President Clinton, is a much more Herculean task than I think anybody can understand and comprehend. And before I would be ready to say, yep, I think I'd like to do that again, I mean, I've told some people that if I jump back into that pool, I want to make sure there's some water in there. It's not much fun to hit the concrete with your head. So a lot of it depends on what happens over the next year. And it's not anything about which I have made a foregone conclusion one way or the other. And to the people who say, oh, he's running, he's definitely running, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Anybody who says that is about as uninformed, well, I'll leave it at that. They're uninformed, okay? I won't continue on the analogy because that would be what would make the news story. I had a good one, by the way, lined up. It was a good one. But anybody who says that there's no way, I mean, they don't know either, because I don't know. So if they know something more definitively than that, they know something I don't know.
So he doesn't know whether he's running for president. We got that. Let's see. Question right over here. Yes, sir. Wait,
Hey,
please
Wayne,
wait. Please
how
wait
are
for
you? It's great to see you.
Wait for the microphone, please, sir.
Are you still running and jogging?
I have a little bit, but this year I have had a real battle with plantar fasciitis on my feet. That is, if you've probably, this is Wayne Williams, a friend of mine from Texarkana, who has been in the aerobics program at Texarkana for a long time. So I know he knows what it is. And it has kept me from doing the distance running. And I've done light running, but I hope that with some orthotics that I now have, I can get back into gear, because it's really been a horrible year for me. If anybody's got a great idea of how to fix that other than orthotics, let me know. I've used that thing at night, the brace that you wear on your foot and all that stuff. It's not very much fun.
Questions? Right here. Yes, sir. The microphone's coming right at you, sir. Please.
My wife and I enjoy your program very much.
Thank you.
We'd like to see if you could get Thomas Sowell as a guest.
I would love to have Thomas Sowell. He is one of the, to me, most insightful, thoughtful, and intellectually capable thinkers and writers that I think is on the scene today. And I find his writings and his thought refreshing. Good idea. We'll work on that.
Yes, sir. We got a question right here. He'll get you the microphone.
I would like to hear your comments on the health legislation.
Glad to. The problem with it is that it doesn't address the real problem, which is chronic disease. This healthcare legislation essentially is an expansion of coverage without understanding that without cost containment, there is no such thing as ever containing the coverage and making it where it's affordable. A few points that I would make. First of all, 80% of all the money that we spend on healthcare in America is on chronic disease. 80%. So $2.5 trillion of healthcare expenditures in this country, and most of it is spent for diseases that could be prevented or cured, and they're primarily caused for three reasons: overeating, underexercising, and smoking. The current health legislation is about covering people. And there's a certainly, I mean, let me just say this, there is a great idea behind coverage, but there's a difference between covering people who are uninsured and covering the uninsurable. We should be covering those who are uninsurable because through no fault of their own, they have debilitating diseases, developmental disabilities. What we did in Arkansas, for example, with the TEFRA program, which extended coverage out to families who had children with developmental disabilities, was very, very helpful in keeping people from being impoverished in order to get any assistance so they could take care of the basic needs of their children. That's an approach that I don't know of anybody who would argue with or disagree with. But the idea that we're going to just extend coverage and force people into coverage, whether they want it or not, if you look at how the bill is structured, either the House or the Senate bill, there are huge penalties for not being covered. But the penalties are such that they are really less expensive than it would be to go into the private marketplace. What eventually will happen is everyone will be driven to the government option, or the public option, or the government option, which is really not optional when it's the only thing that exists. Penalizing the people who have, as it's called, Cadillac insurance seems counterintuitive to me. If the point is to get people to be covered as much as possible so that you have access to the system, why would you penalize people who have already purchased into the system so that they are covered with all the things that they might ever encounter? Now, you're going to tax them and force them at some point to start giving up pieces of their coverage. How does that help? And this is a plan, and this is what a lot of people have not understood. You pay into it. Taxes are collected for 3 years before the benefits even start kicking in. Now, I want you to understand, you're going to pay taxes for 3 years, so the payment is being made for something you don't even get to access until the 4th year. Would anybody here purchase a car and make payments on it for 3 years and let it sit in the parking lot, but you wouldn't get to drive it for 3 years? Would you pay rent on an apartment for 3 years before you could move in? No. Nobody here would do that. And even if it's implemented, there's still going to be 25 million estimated Americans who still won't have coverage. So if the goal is to cover everybody, we're going to spend more than $1 trillion, and we're going to pay long before we get benefits. How does any of that make any sense? Do we need reform in the healthcare system? Absolutely. Of course we do. But we ought to target the reforms, make sure that we see how they're going to work by road testing them in 5 or 6 or 7 states. Does it work? If it does, expand it. If it doesn't work, then don't. Massachusetts and Tennessee are 2 states who tried something along the lines of universal coverage, and in both states it pretty much bankrupted their states, and it did not have the intended consequence of giving people coverage. What it did have was raising the cost and lowering accessibility and increasing waiting times for the people who are in the system. So why would we try something on a 50-state basis when the only experiments we've had with something similar has proven to be a dismal failure? It's probably more than you wanted, but...
Question? Yes, we have.
I love your show, Governor.
Thank you. May your tribe increase. It's my job security right now. So,
bless you, too.
yes, thank you.
My question is, if you had been successful in your run for president, if you were president today, would you sign or veto the $1.1 trillion bill that's coming to you today?
I would have vetoed it. I don't think it would have ever gotten that far. First of all, we would never have had TARP. We wouldn't have had a $787 billion stimulus plan that I think was a porculus plan, not a stimulus, and it is had an adverse effect. We were told that if we did it, we would only have 8% employment at the very top. We've had 10.2. I would not have supported the idea of the bailouts for the private companies. I think it is fundamentally wrong for the government to pick the winners and losers in the marketplace. And this is not a Republican statement. Look, Republicans are as much to blame for the mess we are in as are the Democrats. So let's not be the least bit partisan here. Republicans pushed the TARP bill. It was idiotic. It still went into the idea that the government's job is to pick winners and losers. My position would be this. The government was established by our founders to referee the game, not to play it. How many of you remembered watching the Florida-Arkansas game a few weeks ago in pain and in misery, and watching as in the last moments of the game when Arkansas would have and should have won that game in the swampland against those hideous Gators? How many of you, like me, watched with fury to see the guys in the striped shirts make calls that were so bad, so obviously bad, that the television announcers on ESPN couldn't contain themselves and talked about how bad they were? And the Southeastern Conference did something that I don't ever recall them doing. Rex is the sports, genius here, guru, genius, whatever. I don't ever recall the SEC publicly suspending and admonishing an entire officiating crew like they did. That was unheard of. So it wasn't just that I'm a homer for the Hogs and, you know, had a sore loss, though I admit all those things are true. It was truly the referees helped determine the outcome of the game by their participation at a level that went beyond letting the game play itself. Now, all of us get mad, and if they'd gone the other way, the Florida Gator fans would have been mad. My point is, that the purpose of the guys in the striped shirt is to make sure the game is being played fairly. Who wins and who loses, that's not their domain. It may be that the team that ought to win didn't, or the team that on any given other Saturday would have won. Maybe they don't. That's not the point. The point is you let the game play itself out. You just make sure that it's played within the boundaries of the rules. That's what government is supposed to do. It is not supposed to determine the outcome by saying AIG lives, Bear Stearns lives, Lehman Brothers, you're going down the tubes. That's not the job of government. I've heard people say, well, wouldn't it have been catastrophic? Yes, it would have, for major companies to have failed. But let me tell you what's going to be even more catastrophic, that our grandchildren will be paying for deficits and debts and for having created the precedent of believing that any time if a big company gets in trouble, the government bails them out. But if a small business gets in trouble, what happens? He closes shop and lays people off, and it's just suck it up time. It's a horrible precedent that we've created, and I'm not sure that it will be, but for generations, that we finally get away from that mindset.
Question.
Governor, based on the knowledge that you have now, what would a Mike Huckabee health plan look like on a national basis?
It would have looked a lot more like the Our Kids First program, and there were several reasons that that's been successful. First of all, everybody would have had some skin in the game. There would be no such thing as a completely free health insurance plan. And it would have been structured so that the more responsible choices you made, the less expensive your plan was. It would have clearly defined what is covered under a sense of medical necessity and what is considered a medical option. For example, you get hit by a car, yeah, you should be covered. The question would be, cosmetic surgery? Probably not. Not that anybody is suggesting that under the federal plans they are. But one of the problems we have is when people say, everybody has a right to health care. Well, you're going to get health care on an acute emergency in America now, regardless of your income, period. You're going to get taken to the emergency room. You will get treated. You're not going to be left out there on the gurney in the hallway forever. The real issue is, what is health care? That's the question that nobody seems to want to ask. So tell me what health care is. Where is it of necessity, and where is it at that point optional? And there are positions that I don't consider myself capable of always answering that. Doctors ought to make those decisions and determine what's medically necessary and what simply would make my life more comfortable. So the big thing is that everybody would have some pay-in or some buy-in and some skin in the game. It would be focused on prevention, not intervention, that the whole system, from the way we train doctors to the way we reimburse, would be put on the position of tying that to preventing the disease as opposed to simply intervening once it's out of control. And the final thing would be that the focus of pay would not be on procedures but on outcomes. Because here's the deal, if your doctor doesn't get the diagnosis right and you have to go to him 6 times before he gets it, he gets paid 6 times. If your doctor gets it right the first time, he gets paid 1 time. Now, I would suggest that the doctor who got it right the first time is a better doctor and a more, probably ought to be paid more than the doctor for whom it took 6 times. I'm not saying the doctor it took 6 times shouldn't get paid, but should he get 6 times what the better doctor got? We should be paid, we should be paying out on the ultimate outcome. And the outcome is sometimes not an exacting science, so procedures would be always covered, but there would be bonuses and incentives built in to both the doctor and the patient. For example, if you lower your HDL, your cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, maintain a good heart rate, respiration rate, in other words, all the things on the dashboard of your body, if all those gauges are looking good and you keep them that way, there should be an incentive to you as well as to your doctor for keeping those things in better shape. Otherwise, if you have a car that has to be constantly on the rack and tuned up, or a body, it's going to be more costly. The doctor will be reimbursed more, but he ought to be rewarded for helping you to get to the place where you're healthier. So that would be the fundamental change that we would see.
Yes, Ms. Abrams, right here.
Annie, how you doing? Good to see you.
Annie, hold on just a minute. Let me get you this mic, okay, so we can get this recorded.
When you were elected the first time as our governor, there are many people who thought they were electing a minister. Now that you have lived beyond that time and we now know that you are politically astute, and one of the things is that you believed in forgiveness. two of the times that you lived out that judo principle of forgiveness have come back to, quote, haunt you politically. If you were the president, would you do that again based on your judgment?
Good question, Annie. First of all, I would say that the decisions that I made in the criminal justice arena were not so much based on forgiveness but justice. And to me, there's a difference. It is the purpose of God to forgive. It is not the purpose of the criminal justice system to forgive. It's the purpose of the criminal justice system to make sure that the laws are applied blindly, equally, that without regard to a person's race, gender, ethnicity, or financial standing. I think I hear the inference is the obvious reference to the recent case with Maurice Clemens, which was horrible, and all of us are pained by the outcome, nobody more than me. But as I've said to many people who have asked me about this, if I had the same file sitting in front of me from Maurice Clemens that I had in the year 2000, given the fact that I could not see 9 years into the future, given that what I saw was a case in which a person who at age 16 had committed some really stupid and unfortunate and hideous crimes, adjudicated at 17, served 11 years in our prison system here, but had received a 108-year sentence that had been, instead of stacked concurrently, had been stretched consecutively. And the board came to me with a 5-0 vote with a strong recommendation from a decent and competent judge, as was in the case of Marion Humphrey, who had sent the letter. I would make exactly the same decision that I made. Now, that shocks people to hear it, but I want people to look me in the face and tell me that you think a 16-year-old poor black kid ought to get 108 years for a burglary and an aggravated robbery, when in Arkansas, go check me out on this, people kill people and get 25-year sentences and 12-year sentences. That's their sentence, which means they serve 5 to 7. Served. This kid had served 11. He was sentenced to a life sentence, 108 years. Now, if I had known that he was going to eventually become a habitual criminal, psychotic, and kill police officers, of course I wouldn't have commuted the sentence. But I didn't know that. I made the decision based on the information that I had, not on the information that would one day become. What we have to decide in this country is, do we want a criminal justice system that essentially punishes people to a point that we don't have to even deal with them anymore, or do we want one that is fair? Let me tell you what would happen, and this is blunt, but I'm going to be blunt because I know our time's short. If that kid, had Maurice Clemens been an upper middle class white kid who had done the same things he had done, he would have gotten a probated sentence, a $1,000 fine, 20 hours of community service, and a trip to a counselor. Pure and simple. Believe me, I looked at enough cases, I can tell you that with some degree, but he didn't have a good lawyer, and he didn't have, anybody really going to bat for him. And I'm not saying he was a model citizen that we should say, let's give him, let's just give him another chance because he's poor. Nope. Look, this kid he didn't walk the streets. 11 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections is a hard sentence, folks. And a lot of people at his age would have been put in the juvenile system, not the adult system. So at 17, he went into an adult system even though he was not fully an adult yet. I don't know what 11 years in the system did to a 17-year-old. I don't know. He had sort of a modicum of success at some point when he got out, and then I don't know what happened to him, and he went completely berserk and said things and did things in the last year that are utterly bizarre. What I fear is that because of the political backlash from this, governors in the future will never, ever want to consider clemency. In fact, I was always told, and my own staff would tell me, don't do it. There is no political upside. And I'm going to tell you this, there is no political upside to ever looking at those cases, ever. Nobody's ever going to say, I'm not going to vote for you because you didn't give enough clemencies. That will never, ever happen. But the question is, why did our founders give that responsibility and that role to the executive branch? Because they knew. And if you go back and read the words of Alexander Hamilton, who I wish I could quote him verbatim, but I can't, but the essence of it was that we do not want a system in which we cannot correct the mistakes of excess in the justice system. And there are cases in which excess is a part of it. And you need a check and balance. Now, what I'm fearing is that the hubbub over this case will make it so that not only in Arkansas, but in states across this country, these files won't even get looked at. So I sleep, when people say, how can you sleep at night knowing what this guy did? I sleep better knowing that I did at least honestly do my job, and I looked at every case and I gave it consideration, and I denied a lot more than I ever, in fact, 97% of the time we denied all clemency cases. If you add the pardons, it was still a 90% rate, something like that, of denial. And most all of the pardons were not somebody who was in the prison. They were never in the prison at the time of a pardon. These were people who committed the crime, and often 20 years later, after they have been model citizens and had families, they couldn't pass a background check to work in a nursing home or to work in a school or to do virtually anything. So that simply enabled them and empowered them to be employable. And again, I'll leave it with people to decide if you want automatic responses to justice. If you do, it's real easy. You just simply say no to everything. But I'm not sure that your interest as citizens is ultimately well served, and if that had been your son, your grandson, and he'd been given 108 years as a 16-year-old, I'm sure that you would have said that's too much. And I think you would at least want someone, maybe they'd have made a different decision than me. That's very possible. But I would like to think that you would want them to at least look at the case file and ask, should they look at it?
Got time for one more question, and the person going to ask it, Governor, is the youngest state director in the history of LULAC. His name is Alejandro Aviles. He's a Clinton School student, and he is 20. How old are you, Alejandro? 27.
27.
Thank
I
you.
remember it well when I was 27, yes. Barely remember it, but I can remember it.
Great. Wanted to say love your show, and especially when you're on the comedy show. I'm sorry, the Daily Show with
Oh,
Jon
thank you.
Stewart. Thank you. I want to ask a more serious question. The healthcare reform, we know, it's a very contentious debate now, and we can expect, many people expect immigration reform to be even more contentious and sometimes more hate-filled. I was wondering, well, also during immigration talk in Arkansas, you were a highlight and a great shining light within both parties in Arkansas on that issue. I was wondering, as we approach immigration reform debate in the future, what would you advise the Republican and Democratic Party on how they should focus on this very important issue?
Well, I would never advise the Democrats because I might give them good advice, and I don't want to do that for sure. The Republicans have to be very careful that they are able to distinguish the difference between standing for principles of law and order and recognizing the obvious issue of the growing demographic influence of the Hispanic population. I believe that most of the problem with illegal immigration is the fault of the government, because the government never controlled our borders in any responsible manner and never took any steps to ensure that a person who wanted to come here, a person that frankly we needed in our workforce and had no reason not to want, we never took the steps so that that person could come here and do it legally without going through more trouble exponentially than it would take just to slip across the border. So if it was a young lady that worked on our campaign staff, and her family had immigrated here, and they spent 18 years getting their legal paperwork to become citizens. 18 years. Now, she was very resentful of the fact that people would just slip across the border and, in essence, leapfrog what took them 18 years. So on the one hand, you have people who have worked really, really hard to do everything right, whether it's get a green card or get citizenship. And you know what? I don't blame so much that people wanted to come to America. I blame that the American system made it so that it was harder to do things right than it was to do it wrong. And the consequences for doing it wrong were less severe than the consequences for sometimes trying to do it right. That's not the people's fault. I would say during the campaign, not always a popular statement with everybody, but I always said, I thank God every day that I live in a country that people are trying to break into, not a country they're trying to break out of. And I still believe that. And I think as Americans, we ought to appreciate that people want to come to America because they see this as a land of opportunity and potential. The government has to have a system where, number one, we secure borders. We know who's coming in, who's going out, and why. Number two, there has to be a process. So when someone comes to the border and says, I'd like to come in, I want to work, get a work permit, or I want to come and live and stay permanently, that it shouldn't take 7 to 18 years for the person to go through the steps to legally make that passage. If they don't have a criminal background from their country of origin, if they have legitimate reasons to be here and there is a job waiting and it's not going to affect the job somebody else has, and some basic things that we, I think, could all agree on, Democrat or Republican, then that ought to be a very simple, easy process. Then we know who's here, why they're here, where they are, and if they get in trouble, then they can go home. That makes a lot more sense than this sporadic policy where sometimes we sort of beat our chest, get filled with bravado, and we show how tough we're going to be. And so we take two parents like we did at the plant down in Arkadelphia. I'll never forget the day. I was governor at the time, and we had a raid. The ICE people came in and raided a plant. They took both a mother and a father. There was a 6-month-old child that was in a daycare in Arkadelphia. Nobody bothered to tell the local sheriff or local human services. And at 9 o'clock at night, when no one had picked up this kid, they frantically started wondering what happened to the parents. Well, it turns out they were, at that time, had been hauled off to Texarkana and were being held by the federal authorities with no local person being informed. I was furious. And I spoke out. I got in a lot of political trouble over it because people said, you know, that I was soft on illegal immigration. Wasn't that? I was hard on idiots in the government who would leave a 6-month-old child unattended in a daycare, for heaven's sakes. And I still think that that's outrageous. We can do better than that as a country, and we should. And you have to have a balance between abiding by the law and at the same time recognizing that you have a totally innocent 6-month-old child who is at that point the pawn. Now, for the same reason, I took another equally, if not even more unpopular position for which I paid dearly during the presidential campaign, and that is when we had students who had gone to school in Arkansas, and they had, in many cases, gone kindergarten through the 12th grade, and they had been there because the law required them to be in school. This was, to me, the insanity of this policy. The law required them to be in school. Now, when they got finished with their education, the question was, should they be allowed to be treated as Arkansas residents for the purpose of going to college or not? I was on the position, and remain so, that yes, they should, because they did not commit a crime. If they were brought here when they were 3, 4, 5 years old, they didn't have any role in that decision. You could say, well, their parents broke the law, okay, but we don't have a history in this country of punishing children for what their parents do. We punish the lawbreakers, not the people who are connected to them or related to them. We had a specific case in El Dorado where the kid was the valedictorian of the high school and was brilliant. And the question was, should he qualify for the Arkansas Challenge Scholarship? To me, the answer was, I'd much rather him go to college, become a law-abiding citizen, which part of the process was that he would be in the process of applying for citizenship, get a good education, get a good job, make a good salary, and be a taxpayer. That made more sense to me than taking this kid who was so bright that he beat all the other kids in his class to be #1 and telling him, nope, you're not going to college. We're going to just, you know, maybe you can get a job doing something of manual labor. Nothing wrong with that. But the point is, why would we impose that upon him arbitrarily for no reason or no fault of his own? So I'm upset with our government for not having a policy that makes any sense at all. And I think that a lot of the problems that we've had with the issue ought to be dealing with that. I don't support amnesty. I don't think you give blanket sort of forgiveness and say, okay, all the people that worked really hard to abide by the law, that means nothing. And those of you that have knowingly broken it, that doesn't mean anything either. I'm not an amnesty guy. But it starts with the government making better choices, and I hope that we can do that. And I'd like to think that somewhere that wouldn't be as much a partisan debate as it would be a practical one of how to make this whole system work and make America still a sovereign nation, a free nation, a secure nation, but one that recognizes that its strength has always come from the diversity of people who have come here, just like most of us. I doubt there are many of us whose ancestors go much further back than 400 years. I know mine didn't. I know exactly, you know, they came on the shores of Georgia, dumped out of the debtors' prisons of England. So, you know, my heritage ain't all that spiffy, I can tell you that right now. And I'm glad there weren't some folks at the border saying, go home, illegal immigrant, because, you know, I'd probably be sweeping floors in the area around Liverpool, England right now, which some of you wish I were, I'm sure.
Or you might have been the Beatles.
Gosh, Skip, I never thought about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Mike Huckabee.